and then there's another group of them over there, and then there's like all of a sudden you're surrounded by Oompa Loompas, and the experience can be actually very, very overwhelming.
Who are you and what's your specialty?
Hi, I'm Will, and I have the honor and privilege right now. My profession is leading the Cloud Office of the CTO here at Google Cloud. And I've been doing that gig for the last 5 years, 6 years almost. And before that, a couple decades building stuff I thought was really cool and might be useful for people.
So Octo, what's that all about?
So imagine you could handpick a peer group, and instead of it being hierarchical and someone's the smartest person, they have all the good ideas, and then that person cascades those good ideas down to others to execute. Imagine if you were in an environment where all those people that you've worked with for all these decades, you got together in rooms and you said, what would be possible if X, or if Y, or if Z, and then you were given the freedom to try to catalyze some of those ideas into action in one of the world's largest technology companies. And that's what we do here in the Office of CTO.
So it makes sense to me that a team of CTOs would focus on thought leadership and long-term tech strategy. And Octo's work focuses beyond that on something we call collaborative innovation, which I think sets it apart. Could you maybe tell us a bit more about that?
Sure. So maybe stepping back from it, our CTO function has 3 primary pillars. Our CTO function, collaborative innovation, which is how do we bring some of the Google magic to the largest organizations on the planet, be a really great partner for them on long-term innovation, really disrupt markets, transform industries. The second pillar is more of these, emerging patterns and themes I referred to a little bit earlier, which is, how do we look around the corner for the organization, say these things might be really, really, really important to look out for. And then the third one is, as you mentioned, thought leadership. And to me, it's like one of those journeys. Thought leadership is you never really know if you've accomplished your mission. I think, you could look at reach and followers and, views and things like that. And I think that's all good. But we do it not to establish ourselves as thought leaders, but we actually do it because we really want to share and get feedback, the knowledge that we gain from those first 2 pillars, right? Because when you work with the top couple hundred companies on the planet across all industries and across almost all layers of the tech stack, and you're always constantly looking forward, kind of around the corner, like what's coming next, it turns out that you discover some really important things, but I'm not of the opinion that we should hold them for ourselves, that we should share them with others. And you mentioned collaborative innovation, our first pillar. That is one of the most compelling areas of the work that we do, in my opinion. We roughly spend about 60% of our time in the collaborative innovation pillar. And this is where I think the original premise of the CTO office is most obvious. And that original premise of how do we build a bridge between Google's technology, which is magical things happening all over the place, but they're kind of happening all over the place and most people don't know about them. How do we connect that innovation system with the innovation system of our customers? Because one of the premises I reject is that Google is the only place where innovation happens. Absolutely not true. I come from aerospace, I come from defense, I come from public sector, and I can tell you that I was involved in projects there that would make people at Google really, really excited. And the scale and the scope and the complexity and the frontiers that we were exploring, super, super interesting. And it turns out every once in a while, those organizations that are innovating for their industry and Google, which is kind of building horizontal tech platforms and products, right, to be used by many, it turns out that every once in a while, those intersections can be really disruptive. Thing is, you just don't know where they are. So you have to get out into the world and you have to find them. And, that is this collaborative innovation pillar is the thing that grounds us in like the reality of our mission, right? It brings us back to the challenges and to the optimism for why we think we can continue to make a difference and reinforce our missions. So for example, I was working with a large bank 4 or 5 years ago on something that today is considered one of the most important use cases in all of financial services and kind of where machine learning and automation may play a really large role, which is anti-money laundering. Well, these banks have been after solving this problem for a very long time. And they know they have this richness around their environment and the context and how that system works and how these systems work and how they function. And Google has technology that can be very, very relevant. But how do you pull these two organizations together? Right? You have the classic vendor model, which is we're going to issue an RFP and we want you to bid to the RFP and show us what you got. That's a very standard. That type of approach does not work on the frontier. And it requires a collaborative back and forth, challenging, scoping, revisiting approach. And that's why we don't call it innovation. That's why we call it collaborative innovation, because the cycles, if you can shorten the loop of the information sharing and you can tighten the trust bonds between these two organizations, you can end up moving faster than a traditional issue you a problem, I build something to spec, it doesn't work, we come back again, and it feels like an A/B test of SaaS software versus something we built together. Mm-hmm. And collaborative innovation is the core. It's like that solid core of our team, because once we've experienced that, once we know what it's really like to try hard against one of those use cases, one of those problems, one of those industries, we can now extend that. We can say, I wonder if other people are also trying to solve fraud, but in different industries, maybe in payments, or maybe in retail, or maybe somewhere else. And now it gives us the fuel to ask the questions that lead to some of the insights in our emerging themes pillar 2, which then, if we've actually moved the ball a little bit in pillar 1, and we're orienting more for pillar 2 in this horizontal technology platform investment, now we have something interesting to share with the rest of the world. And that's how it all comes together.
From Google's point of view, what are the top principles of innovation that we should apply to these challenges?
Well, you can imagine a company that's been around for a couple decades and has really, I think, established itself as an innovation brand, has a lot to say about innovation. The way I've experienced it at Google very personally over the last 6 years, I'll tell you there's one framework that really stands out to me. And when I first joined Google, I was introduced to this thing called the Collaborative Skills for Innovation Workshop. Frederick Furt, who's our innovation evangelist here at Google, is one of the people who kind of chairs this community within Google. And it's really incredible because it essentially introduces all new Google people, if you're interested, to kind of the distilled principles of innovation within Google. And so I experienced this firsthand. And as you know, because I've dragged you through it as well, I find it to be really, really powerful and applicable to a lot of different scenarios. And it has 3 pieces. So the first piece is about focusing on the user. This gets very much into the core DNA of Google. But I think it's also it really resonates with the search for the problem. Right? So quite often we'll make assumptions about what users want, but it's really, it can be a dangerous product development pattern to make too many assumptions about what users want versus really trying to neck down on a really, really interesting problem. And I will tell you that having worked with hundreds and hundreds of companies while at Google, top brands, some of the most innovative companies in the world, it's very easy for Google and it's very easy for those companies to get so enamored with technology or a business KPI to lose sight of some of the underlying conditions that may represent the real problem. So what might be an example of this? Well, let's say that you want to improve shoppers' experience inside of a retail store. So let's say you're really interested in how technology can play a part in that. And so you go and you might conduct a bunch of surveys. You might ask people what they want, and they'll respond back, like the lines are too long, or there's we'd like to have more automation inside the store to allow us to check prices ourselves, or just reduce the friction. And it'd be really easy to run off, because that sounds, I saw you smile when I described it. That sounds like a really fun, like technology driven problem, right? Like let's go after it.
Oh yeah.
But it's interesting what happens when you start asking why, and you start asking a wider group of people, not just the product development team, and not just the UX research team, and not just the the 10 shoppers or the 100 shoppers in Grab, but actually bringing people in from non-traditional sources. So for example, in that scenario, typically you would look at a store manager and you would look at the local IT team, but would you really consider the operations and security group from an organization like that as part of the innovation workstream? It turns out we were working with a large retailer, and in the early going of the problem definitions, focusing on the user, we realized that we didn't know much about the problem. So we decided to invite a pretty big cross section from the customer to participate. They even asked us why we would have some of these people in the meeting, because it wasn't, they're not IT, they're not engineering. Like what the heck?
Pretty unusual.
What the heck? And lo and behold, we didn't obviously craft it this way, but it just happened. We're trying to solve this problem, and we were getting a little bit stuck around why people, why we kept seeing a trend in some of the feedback from the shoppers. We were wondering why we weren't rushing in to solve the problem in a certain way. And the security and ops team gave us a really interesting insight, which is, we would rather sacrifice a little bit of performance on this certain metric than disturb the customer in a way that feels overly intrusive. And it kind of made all of us sit back in our chairs a little bit and go, we've been solving for, we're solving for a problem that if we had solved in a traditional way, we would intervene to try to kind of disrupt the flow of friction for these shoppers. And it ends up that the way they looked at the problem was, actually, you know what? If they get it mostly right, we're okay with that, because their feedback was that over time, they'd much rather have less intervention from humans and feel like they were in control of their buying process end to end. They could get what they needed and they could make their way out of the store. And so instead of prompting for human intervention, instead we focused on data capture, data collection to see where the points of friction were in some of the point of sale locations and the rest. And that ends up feeding lots of different innovation pipelines later on. But our first hypothesis was, they're seeing friction, they can't resolve it. We should set up like more notifications and prompts to get people to come over and help them. And that's actually exactly the wrong way to solve the problem. But we wouldn't have even known that if people from a function not related to engineering and not related to product weren't with us. So that's the first tenet. And I spent a lot of time on it because it is also the most important tenet of this kind of 3 principles of innovation at Google, focusing on the user. And it's ironic because the rest of the sentence in our original value system was focus on the user and all else will follow. Kind of the same thing with the next 2 principles. If you're really well aligned on that problem statement or that sense of how you want to solve the problem, then you can get into really creative, imaginative ways of trying to solve the problem because you feel really well aligned. And that's where this thinking 10x comes into play. So if we're going to solve a problem, we want to make sure it's material. And it has to be relevant over a long period of time, because I don't know about you and your experience, because you have some experience in startups and large organizations as well. My experience tells me, being in both startups and large organizations, that it takes between 6 to 7 years from the time that you actually conceive of something for you to get, product market fit that kind of, you get escape velocity. There's a lot of stories about the overnight successes, but on average, most businesses, whether big or small, it takes a long time, it takes a lot longer to realize the fruits of that innovation.
Yeah, you can feel like you're getting there in a couple of months with a prototype. But to actually shake out all the edge cases, you get some time.
Exactly. So that's why you have to think big. It's not just because thinking big is fun. It is. But actually, your results have to be relevant over such a long time horizon that if you're not really shooting for a big enough objective, you may actually succeed incrementally and be totally irrelevant by the time you're ready. So that's the thinking 10x, which is a hallmark. People generally associate, the moonshots and the rest with Google. But that's the reasoning behind it, is actually the relevance as when you eventually solve the problem, are you even relevant? And then the last bit is probably the most fun, and that is the rapid prototyping. So if you're focused on the user, focused on that problem, right, and you got really big ideas and you're ready to let it go, we've often seen that lowering the barrier to getting started is critical bit in innovation, to the point where we've mocked up using actual physical mock-ups of digital systems just to get people started. I was working with one customer who a sawmill, and they were thinking about how to optimize the cuts on the timber logs that come through the sawmill. And it required a new workflow on the floor and some data entry by people who normally wouldn't be involved in data entry or kind of digital platforms. So we weren't going to build something. We're going to build apps and like hardware if we didn't know if it was going to work or not. So instead, what we did is we literally on pieces of paper, we wrote what the UI would look like. We put it on pieces of wood and we handed it to people. And we said, okay, now when you want to do this, there's a function to do that. When you want to do that, there's a function to do that. We just want to see how you interact, or when you would normally interact with this. And it gave us a lot of really big insight around, not only the technology we were building, but how it would get adopted and the reluctance for these individuals or not, to adopt. And we were able to identify some early adopter candidates who would then, be very useful to bringing it out. But the rapid prototyping doesn't always mean code. Sometimes it means actually just physical prototypes that represent a digital system and allow us to get started. And that took, a couple bucks and a couple minutes to get rolling, to inform, the eventual product loop. So those are three big pillars.
Serving as a leader in 2020 was a challenge for so many of us. It stretched us and tested us in ways we never anticipated. And because the conditions were so different than anything we've experienced before in our careers. And there are kind of fundamental principles that I know you've turned to in order to give your team the leadership they deserved in those troubling times. Could you share with us some of those principles that you turned to when things were so shaken up?
Sure. So the first one, and this is by far the most important one, is to just make the assumption that I have no idea what you're going through. And that may sound really bad. And it's a little disconcerting as an individual, right? Like my job, part of my job, a big part of my job, you could argue the biggest part of my job, is having my finger on the pulse of the team and being able to adjust on the fly the environment, the tactics, the mission, all the components from a work perspective that go into how empowered, enabled, excited people feel about, their role in our team and generally their work. But I discovered very quickly that I had no idea what was going on. Some people have, pandemic, some people have children. And some of them are younger. Some of them are closer to leaving the house. Some of them are older. Some people don't have children. Some people have significant others. Some don't. Some have really high quality bandwidth. Some don't, right? Some needed to take time to care for family members. Some don't. And I think one of the things that hopefully has allowed us to navigate so far the conditions, within our team at least, is the constant questioning of, are we doing enough to make it okay, regardless of, which one of those categories, and people on our team fall across a range of those categories, right? Combinations of those categories, that you feel like you have the space, the time, and the support, regardless of, the intersectionality of those dynamics. And but it has to start with, in my opinion, it has to start with the realization that I actually don't know, and that I will never know. It was a little bit easier when we could bump into each other in the hallway, and could chit chat for a couple of minutes, and I can kind of get a bead on like what's going on. I could check out body language, the rest. It was a real eye opener for me when I shared a picture. So I had my laptop set up, and I had the laptop camera, and I had my setup, and everybody's like, "Oh, your background's like really fancy." And then I showed the team, a picture of what it actually looked like when I took a picture with my phone and showed it to everybody. It was literally like my laptop on a set of moving boxes and my mouse on an old shredder that I, had. And I think it was an interesting moment where people are like, wow, we make a whole lot of assumptions about, like what you see here looks really, like it's all put together. Will's got it all. He's all under control. Will's got it all under control. And the truth is, like, I'm bound together by Band-Aids and, wire and gum. I have MacGyvered, for those of you that know that reference. I have MacGyvered my, environment to present just a little bit of that. But I figured, hey, if I'm just barely keeping it together, right, and try, how many of those images that we see on the GVC in our video meetings, how many people are just barely keeping it together, and they're showing us kind of their Hollywood version of their experience?
Yeah, well, that's what we do, right? We just we put that smile on, and we show up.
It's Hollywood. Yeah.
You get to work with like some of the most successful and powerful business people in the world, which I'm sure is a treat. I feel like it is. What are the patterns that you see again and again working with these people that allow those top leaders to be really successful with innovation relative to others?
The balance. This one sticks out pretty clearly to me, but it's taken a lot of pain to come to this viewpoint, and that is that the best technology in the world, without consideration of people and process that allow that technology to be successful, is doomed to fail. And it doesn't matter if it's a CTO, CIO, CEO, CMO, pick anybody in the C-suite that I would generally deal with on a day-to-day basis. Maybe this experience echoes your own, right? Because you're very much involved in guiding and coaching and being a partner in innovation with the same persona, same types of humans. The highest hit rate is when these new technologies are considered in the context in which they operate. And that's the human context as well as the larger market context, and what's feasible, what's infeasible. Because there's a difference between pushing for step change improvement and a new frontier, and just being wildly out of control in terms of setting expectations. And, in the end of the day, these CTOs, CIOs, CEOs, they're humans. And when they take chances on emerging technology to try to gain that competitive differentiation, whether it's in lowering their cost basis or in generating revenue in ways that their competition can't, either way, it's a bet they're making, and not just for the business, but for themselves. And so, humanizing the adoption of technology within an organization, both locally to that decision maker, but then also broadly within their organization, is one of the real key focal points for me these days. And what I see increasingly as, like, for example, our team, the CTO office, I think we become much more useful to our customers when we're able to do things like tell better stories or help them tell better stories. This is a very human way of producing change, right? And the classic arc of the hero narrative, and the conflict and the resolution of conflict. And it sounds very simple, and it sounds very straightforward. And I see you smiling.
Well, the ones who are the best at it, like they rock it. They really are. Yeah.
Look at the moments created in technology, whether it was the smartphone or, more recently, the this kind of articulation of digital transformation, through cloud, like these big moments need big stories, and they need to capture the hearts and the minds of all the people involved, because one, for all the models that we have and all the data that we have, there's a lot of uncertainty in how these projects play out. And acknowledging that uncertainty and forming a basis of why a customer should trust, for in this, in our example, Google, or trust each other. Why would a customer trust their ecosystem? Why would a customer trust their partners? That's really foundational, because that's the bridge between what the math and the data and the patterns and the architecture diagrams and the blueprints will tell you, and what needs to be done in order to be successful at scale. Because in many ways and in many shapes and forms, how cloud or machine learning or quantum, if you really want to stretch our brains, how those technologies will influence markets is still to be determined. So there's still a process of sorting between, early adopters and mass market consumption. And it's in that space, right, that leadership space, that activation usually happens based on some level of trust.
There's a bunch of cutting edge engineering happening at Google and other alphabet companies, and some of that innovation could turn into real game changers. What's maybe one or two that have you the most excited, and why?
Sure. Well, I'm glad you asked this question. And I'll tell you, before I answer your question directly, I'll also tell you something, very personal, which is one of the reasons why I came to Google is because I feel like it's almost like Willy Wonka's chocolate factory of technology. It's like every time you turn around, there's something being built by some group of people, and you experience it for the first time. You're like, that is home. That is like, I would have no idea that there was an Oompa Loompa, hiding around the corner, but yet there it is. And then there's another group of them over there, and then there's like, all of a sudden you're surrounded by Oompa Loompas, and the experience can be actually very, very overwhelming. And something I experienced very early on in Google, which I've had to sort through, is where was I actually going to focus? Because it's really easy to see all the bright lights and just stare at them and become, almost entranced by all the bright lights. Because there are a lot of very incredible people at Google doing a lot of very incredible things, only a fraction of which, right, are out in the, publicly available, go buy, your SaaS, or go buy your cloud, or go, to dev tools, or, go over here to this framework. There's so much more going on. It's just really daunting. But to your question, there are a couple areas I'm very, very interested in right now, personally interested in. In fact, I'm gonna, since you asked, I'm just gonna reach over here on my desk and pick up my little prop here. So this is area number one, and area number one is the intersection of tiny machine learning and the world around us. So I personally strongly believe, that the architecture of customer experiences will more and more push to the edge. And because of that, taking what we do kind of with heavy lifting and large farms of GPUs, graphical processing units, or TPUs, tensor processing units, or kind of large scale cloud machine learning, we will have to consider running those in less capable, less connected environments. And one is for performance reasons, right? It's just people are going to have phones, and they're going to have smart watches, and they're going to have devices, and they're going to be in the house. It's probably pretty high level of automation down the road. But it's also because we want to be able to give people the power of machine learning in a way that feels private and safe and secure in however you want to dial the knob, which means a deep understanding of machine learning, but also a deep understanding of limited computational environments, how people actually want to experience their lives in the day-to-day, right? Because we can sometimes make assumptions about that, because we live in we're kind of in Silicon Valley, in the place where a lot of these technologies are just part of everyday life, because this is the origin point for so many of them. But if your experience may be very different if you are in the Midwest of the United States, or in a country that is not even connected, right, or a municipality that's not even connected. So I'm very personally interested. I think the frontier of machine learning at the edge is going to be one of the most interesting and likely disruptive forces in terms of creating customer experience, but also in managing privacy and how an individual wants to share or not share their information with larger automation, machine learning pipelines and companies and tech companies.
Your team is considerably more diverse in a number of dimensions than others trying to achieve similar goals. And what aspects of diversity do you think about the most, and what specific things do you do to attract and grow a team like that?
Well, first off, I'll just make one small correction, which is it's our team, Adrian. I consider you co-owner of our little concern here. There are a couple things that underlie my approach. One is it's just the way that it has always been in teams and in organizations that I have been a part of and where we've been successful. So, for example, I started in the military. Military is one of the most diverse organizations on the planet, especially at scale, right? You're talking about, million plus people in the U.S. Department of Defense. And if you look at the demographics of while it does, for example, some of the more combat-facing organizations skews heavily male, generally speaking, the Department of Defense is one of the most diverse organizations on the planet. And that was a really great place to start my career. That was a really great place to start. And it's not just about, it wasn't just in one dimension. It was, you had people from all walks of life, from all of the states in the United States. You had people from, engineering to operations to logistics to medical. And so what was really cool was watching all those functions come together and all those different backgrounds come together and all those different people come together around a mission. And, those lessons stuck with me and have stayed with me my entire career. And I have seen firsthand the power of a group of people who don't think about boundaries or limitations based on where they're from, who they are, or their specific attributes, but who believe in themselves and each other and in a mission and have enough creative disagreement to produce better outcomes over time, right? Because a lot of people, I think, view the military as a very top-down hierarchical organization, and that can certainly be true. But my experience with the military was it also encouraged people to think about what they were being asked to do, to not over-prescribe. So me as a captain, for example, within the military, my job wasn't to prescribe how people should do their jobs. It was to clarify the mission that we were on. And the most important thing that we had to accomplish in that mission, because 9 times out of 10, whatever plans we had went out the window as soon as things started. And I find a very interesting parallel into commercial industry, tech industry. So for example, the team that we're a part of now, the Office of CTO. It's a business imperative, it's a functional imperative, it's a mission imperative that the people that we have in this team represent different walks of life, different geographies, different regional affinities, different genders, different, think about all of the ways in which we have to proxy the world around us. And so if we only have, folks who can represent, the viewpoint of a very insular Silicon Valley, demographic, then we are not going to be able to effectively do our job. So that's, to your question of why am I oriented this way? It's because I've seen it. I've seen the power and I've seen what happens when you actually focus on not just bringing a diverse group of people together, and not just centered on a mission, but you actually give them the space to provide that unique insight, opinion, background in a way that's honored and respected, the same as if no one's opinion is more valued than the other. In terms of implementation, it's super simple. It is super simple. You just have to do it. It really, really boggles my mind when I get the feedback, oh, it's really, Will, it's, I get this from, my peers. I get this, I struggle with it. But, at some point, if you believe in it and you know that it produces business results, you just kind of have to make it happen. And that's our job as leaders, is to make it happen, and to make it happen in a way that is good, right? And that is respectful, and that is, the way that we would want to be invited in to any really interesting endeavor or team. And the little stuff matters a lot, right? Shut down a person once, you're highly likely not to get them back again. Yeah. People
well, doing
will
it, maybe, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, please.
Like, I've learned in working under these circumstances that it's not so much about forming consensus around things. It's about having creative or constructive disagreement about an idea, and that perspective allows us to make a better outcome.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
That is not the conditions necessarily that all of us, all of us that are watching today, are operating in. But if we set the circumstances so that we have lots of varied points of view, we have those kinds of disagreements and get better designs and better results. So,
but it's the little things, Adrian, it's the little things. Like in implementation, it's the little things, which is, let's say you've got, in these days, we're all dealing with, like video chats, right? At like some super high scale in tech, right? Like all of our meetings are remote. We've got a jillion people on the video call. And it's really easy to not have some voices be heard. It's super easy. And it's not destructive in any way, right? Like, I don't think a leader is maybe intentionally, deciding to silence someone, right? Because that's the obvious stuff. The obvious stuff is easier to see. It's easier to root out. It's easier to get rid of. But the nuanced forms of this, right? Like if we really want people's opinions and voices to be heard, we have to give them multiple ways to provide it, because some people like to jump in on a 50-person video chat, raise their hand, and ask their questions. Some people will never do that. And it's not good to call them out, but it's also not okay to leave their opinion behind. Mm-hmm. So one of the things I think about a lot, and one of the things we do a lot in our team, as you know, is we provide multiple forums to bring insights and opinions in. So some people who like the written form do the written form. Some people, and we have docs, and we have processes that allow for docs to be reviewed by the entire team. We record all of our team meetings, we distribute them out, we circle back. All of these mechanisms, they may sound super tactical, and they may sound super boring, but that's actually the connective tissue of, sure, maybe you can convince someone to join your team, and maybe you can give them a really fancy like title or role or like prestige or whatever. But, you show up in 10 forums, or over a course of a year, if you feel like your voice isn't being heard, it's not going to last for very long. And those tactics end up being absolutely critical to long-term cultural team dynamics, right? Not optimizing for the short run, but optimizing for the long run.
So Google is a place that really encourages creativity and extends, creative license so that somebody can follow their own passions by taking on projects in a way that, might help Google in the long run, and hopefully it makes the world a better place in the process. What kind of passion projects have you taken notice of because of their impact, either at work or beyond what we do at work?
One of the ones that sticks out to me right away is we had someone in our team suggest that maybe we ought to fund some the initial projects for a bunch of startups that are working as kind of non-governmental organizations, NGOs, or doing things for the world that don't strictly fall into direct line of like significant commerce, but they're doing things such as measuring the air quality in their local region, and they wanted to send some of that analysis to the cloud, and they just didn't know how to get started. And so we had a member of our team literally create a bridge between what we do and our sources of funding and our sources of sponsorship and this other organization, which is really well known at Google, called Google.org. And this was a couple of years ago, and just decided to try. Like, it started with a spreadsheet of what are the organizations that are seeking help from Google, and where do people on our team have a passion for making a difference. And one of the things that it really highlighted for me is that so many people want to make a difference, they just don't know where to start. But this person in our team had the insight that if I could just provide visibility into where the needs were and make a little bit of a, simplify the path to joining the people and the need, then maybe our impact would be really, really significant. And now 18 months later, 2 years, just barely 2 years later, we fund a significant amount of, last year, I think 35 different organizations received funding from Google Cloud and from the Office of CTO to go take on problems in our world that aren't directly related to retail, financial services, or the rest, but are really, really important to making the world a better place. And it all happened because one person in our team just decided to take it upon themselves to reach out, create the list, chase down some sponsors, right, and do that. And I think we typically think about 20% projects, or Google has a strong brand around 20% projects as where we go and write code in the corner on something that we care a lot about. And there's plenty of that. There's also this connective tissue that Google people create, where they connect the dots, they connect people, they connect passion, they connect to people to a stronger sense of something that's really important to them personally. And you could argue at our scale, that's just as valuable as a really, really unusually great and succinct code base to solve a point problem.
Thanks, Will, for having this conversation with me. I look forward to maybe doing it again sometime.
Absolutely, Adrian. My pleasure.